The rain fell in relentless sheets, tapping against the glass walls of the mansion like thousands of whispering fingers. Inside, the billionaire sat alone in his vast study, surrounded by silence and the faint ticking of an antique clock. The world outside his gates did not concern him anymore, not since life had taught him that money could buy everything but peace. He had built walls higher than any fortress, both around his home and around his heart. That night, as he signed another set of contracts under the dim light of his desk lamp, a sudden buzz broke through the quiet. The intercom light flashed red. Someone was at the gate. He frowned. No one ever came this late, not without an appointment, not without permission. He pressed the button, expecting to see the face of a security guard, but what appeared on the monitor froze him in place. A woman stood in the rain, her clothes drenched, her hair clinging to her pale face. She was holding her belly with both hands, her lips trembling, eyes full of exhaustion and fear. For a moment he thought it was some cruel hallucination. The sight of her brought back memories he had buried years ago, memories he had sworn to forget. He leaned closer to the screen, his heart thudding in his chest. The camera's lens caught the glint of something familiar in her eyes. He switched on the speaker. His voice, cold and distant, echoed through the gate speaker system as he asked who she was and what she wanted. For a few seconds there was no reply, only the sound of rain and distant thunder. Then she looked directly into the camera and whispered something so faint it was almost drowned by the storm. His name. Hearing it sent a chill down his spine. Nobody outside his closest circle dared to speak his name like that. Softly, trembling, filled with emotion. He felt his throat tighten as if the air had thickened around him. He stood up abruptly, knocking over a glass of water that spilled across the polished surface of his desk. Without thinking, he grabbed his coat and headed for the front door. Outside, the rain hit his face like needles, but he didn't care. The security guards moved toward him, confused, asking if they should escort the woman away. He raised a hand to stop them. "Open the gate," he said, his voice sharp and commanding, though it trembled at the edges. The guards hesitated but obeyed. The heavy metal gates creaked open, and the woman took an unsteady step forward, her knees trembling as if each movement drained what little strength she had left. He approached slowly, the rain soaking through his coat, his eyes fixed on her face. Up close, she looked even more fragile than she had on the screen. Her lips were pale, her hands trembling as she tried to steady herself. She whispered his name again, weaker this time, her voice barely audible above the rain. He wanted to ask how she had found him, where she had been all these years, but before he could say a word, she swayed on her feet. Instinct took over. He reached out, catching her just as she collapsed against him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. He could feel her heart beating weakly, her breath shallow and quick. Her clothes were soaked, cold to the touch. Without thinking, he lifted her into his arms and carried her toward the mansion. The guards looked at him in disbelief, but he ignored them. Inside, the warmth of the grand hallway met them, a sharp contrast to the storm outside. He laid her gently on the couch, calling for the house staff, who rushed in with towels and blankets. The doctor, who lived nearby, was summoned immediately. As they worked to warm her up, he stood a few feet away, staring at her face. The years had changed her, but not enough to erase the memories, the laughter, the promises, the night she vanished without a trace. When the doctor finally arrived, he examined her carefully, speaking in a calm, professional tone. "She's exhausted," he said, dehydrated, undernourished, and close to labor. The billionaire felt his stomach twist. Close to labor? He glanced at her belly, now visible under the loose fabric of her drenched dress. His thoughts spiraled, questions colliding faster than he could think them. Who was the father? Why had she come to him? Why now after all these years? The doctor left instructions for rest and nourishment, then stepped away, leaving him alone with her once again. He sat down across from her, the crackle of the fireplace filling the silence. Her eyelids fluttered open, revealing eyes that held both pain and recognition. For a moment she didn't speak. She simply looked at him as if seeing a ghost. Then in a faint, trembling voice she whispered, "I didn't know where else to go." The words hit him harder than any accusation. He opened his mouth to reply, but the weight of years pressed down on him. There was so much he wanted to say, yet none of it would fit into words. So he sat there silent, watching as she drifted back into uneasy sleep. The storm outside raged on, but inside the mansion, a different kind of storm was brewing. one that would tear open wounds neither of them had ever truly healed. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the woman who had once been the reason for both his happiness and his heartbreak. The sound of rain on the windows filled the silence, steady and haunting. Somewhere deep inside he knew that this was no accident, that her arrival tonight was fate's way of reopening a story he thought had ended long ago. And as the fire flickered beside her sleeping face, he realized with a sinking feeling that his life, so carefully controlled, so perfectly built, would never be the same again. The storm had passed by morning, leaving behind a thick fog that clung to the hills surrounding the mansion. The world outside was eerily quiet, as if it too was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. Inside, the billionaire sat by the window, his mind restless, his eyes heavy with the weight of the night before. Every sound in the house, the ticking clock, the soft crackle of the dying fire, felt louder than usual. He hadn't slept at all. The image of her soaked face, her trembling hands, and the way she had whispered his name kept replaying in his mind like a haunting melody. He didn't know what to feel, anger, relief, or fear. Years ago, she had vanished from his life without warning, leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions and a hollow ache he had learned to bury under money and success. And now, out of nowhere, she was back, fragile, pregnant, and silent. When the sun rose fully, he finally stood and walked toward the living room. She was still asleep on the couch, wrapped in soft blankets. Her breathing was steady now, but her face was pale, her lips cracked, her hair tangled from the rain. He stood there for a long time, studying her as if trying to decide whether she was real. The past had a cruel way of finding him, and part of him wanted to believe this was some cruel dream. But as he watched her chest rise and fall, he knew it wasn't. She was really here, the woman who had once owned his heart and then disappeared without a trace. He turned away, running a hand through his hair, trying to control the thoughts flooding his mind. Questions clawed at him from all sides. Why had she come here? Why now, and whose child was she carrying? He couldn't bring himself to ask, not yet. For now, he just wanted to understand how fate had led her back to his doorstep. A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. "You haven't changed," she whispered weakly, her eyes half open as she looked up at him. He froze, unsure how to respond. Her tone wasn't bitter. It was tired, full of sadness and something deeper, something like regret. He took a slow breath before replying, his voice calm but distant. "I wish I could say the same." The words came out harsher than he meant, and for a moment she looked hurt. Silence fell again, broken only by the faint crackling of the fire. She sat up slowly, wincing slightly from the strain. He noticed her struggling and reached out instinctively, but she shook her head, refusing his help. "I can manage," she said softly, her pride still intact despite everything. He sat down across from her, their eyes finally meeting fully. Years of distance, betrayal, and unanswered questions hung in the air between them. "Why are you here?" he asked finally, his voice low but firm. She hesitated, her fingers clutching the edge of the blanket. "Because I had nowhere else to go," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't come to ask for forgiveness or money. I just needed a place to rest, just for a night." He studied her face, searching for lies, but all he saw was exhaustion. "You vanished," he said quietly, without a word. "Do you have any idea what that did to me?" His voice cracked slightly, the calm mask slipping for a moment. Her eyes filled with tears, but she looked down, refusing to meet his gaze. "If I told you the truth," she whispered, "you wouldn't have believed me." The tension between them thickened, heavy and painful. He leaned back in his chair, watching her closely. "Try me," he said, his tone softening just enough to make her glance up. She opened her mouth to speak but stopped, as if the words were too heavy to carry. After a long pause, she said, "There are things you don't know. Things that happened after I left. I didn't want to leave you. I was forced to." Her voice trembled, breaking slightly at the end. He frowned, confusion mixing with disbelief. "Forced?" he repeated. "By who?" She shook her head, her eyes filling again. "It doesn't matter anymore. It's over." But he didn't accept that answer. He leaned forward, his tone sharper now. "It matters to me. You can't just walk into my life again after all these years looking like this and tell me none of it matters." Her breath hitched, her hand instinctively resting on her belly. "Please," she whispered, "don't make this harder." He stared at her hand on her stomach, his pulse quickening. "That child," he said slowly. his voice trembling between fear and anger. Is it mine? The question hung in the air like thunder. She froze, her lips parting slightly, but no words came out. Her silence was deafening. He stood up abruptly, pacing the room, running his hand over his face. You could have told me, he muttered. All these years I thought you were dead. I searched for you. His voice broke, raw and unguarded. And now you show up at my door carrying a child and you expect me not to ask? Her tears finally fell. I wanted to tell you, she said, her voice shaking. But I couldn't, they wouldn't let me. He turned toward her, confusion and frustration battling across his face. Who are they? He demanded, but she only shook her head again, her shoulders trembling. You don't understand, she whispered. If I talk, it will destroy you too. He stared at her, speechless, his heart pounding. The truth sat just beyond his reach, close enough to taste but too dangerous to touch. Somewhere deep down, he realized that whatever had happened all those years ago was far darker than he could have imagined. And now, as the fog outside thickened, he knew one thing for certain. Her arrival wasn't just a coincidence. It was a warning, and the storm that began last night was only just beginning. The mansion seemed quieter that evening, but the silence was no longer peaceful. It was the kind that carried tension, secrets, and words left unsaid. The billionaire had spent the entire day in his study, pretending to work, though his mind was far from business. Every tick of the clock echoed the same question. Who were they? And what kind of danger could she possibly be running from after all these years? He tried to convince himself that she was exaggerating, that perhaps she was delusional or confused, but deep down, something told him she was telling the truth. The fear in her eyes last night wasn't something that could be faked. It was the kind that came from living through something terrible, something that still haunted her. As dusk fell, the air outside turned heavy again, the scent of rain lingering in the breeze. From his window he could see her sitting in the garden, wrapped in one of the mansion's old shawls, staring blankly at the fading horizon. She looked so small, so fragile against the vastness of his estate, a quiet reminder that all his wealth and walls couldn't keep the past from finding him. He hesitated for a moment before walking outside, his footsteps crunching softly against the gravel. She didn't turn to look at him when he approached. She just kept watching the sky, her hands resting protectively over her stomach. Why do? I feel like you're hiding something from me, he asked quietly. His voice was calm, but beneath it was frustration mixed with a strange tenderness he couldn't shake. She sighed, her breath visible in the cool air. Because I am, she whispered, not turning toward him. But not because I want to, because I have to. He frowned. You think I can't protect you? He said, his tone rising slightly. After everything I've built, after everything I have? She finally turned to face him, her eyes filled with sadness. You can protect yourself, she said softly, but not from them, not from what they've already done. He stared at her, his pulse quickening. Who are they? He demanded again. Her lips trembled as she spoke. The people you used to work with. The ones who made you who you are. You think your fortune came without a cost? Someone paid the price even if you didn't see it? Her words hit him like a cold wave. He stepped back, shaking his head. That's impossible, he muttered. You don't know what you're talking about. But she didn't look away. I do, she said, her voice steady now. Because I was there when they made the deal. I was the one who lost everything so you could have it all. The wind picked up, carrying her words into the darkening sky, and for a long moment, he couldn't breathe. He stared at her, disbelief etched across his face. You're lying, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. That's not true. But she only gave him a sad smile. You always needed proof, didn't you? She said quietly. You never believed anything unless you could measure it, count it, or buy it. But some things don't leave receipts. He turned away, rubbing his temples, his thoughts spiraling. Her words didn't make sense. And yet, deep inside, something about them felt painfully familiar. There were things about his rise to power that had never quite added up. Deals that had closed too easily. Competitors who had vanished without explanation. a silent partner he had never met in person. He had convinced himself it was just luck and good timing. But now, looking at her, he wasn't so sure. She stood up slowly, her movements careful, her breath shallow. "I didn't come here to destroy you," she said softly. "I came because I couldn't run anymore. They think I'm dead. But if they find out I'm here, they'll come for both of us." He turned sharply toward her, his eyes wide. "What are you saying? You're in danger?" She nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "Not just me. The baby, too." A cold shiver ran through him. "You still haven't told me," he said in a low voice. "Is it mine?" Her eyes met his, full of sorrow. "If I tell you yes," she whispered, "you'll never let us go. If I tell you no, you'll stop caring. So maybe it's better if you just protect us without asking why." Her answer cut deeper than he expected. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, a noise echoed from the main road. The sharp crunch of tires on gravel, followed by the faint hum of an engine. Both of them turned toward the gate at the same time. 2 black cars were slowly approaching, headlights cutting through the fog. His security system should have alerted him, but it hadn't. He felt his stomach twist with unease. She gripped his arm suddenly, her fingers cold and trembling. "They found me," she whispered. "Please, you have to hide me. You have to protect the baby." He froze, trying to make sense of what was happening. "Who are they?" he asked again, his voice low but urgent. "Tell me who they are." But she just shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. "You don't understand," she said, her voice breaking. "Once they're here, there's no going back." The sound of the cars grew louder, closer. He looked toward the mansion, then back at her. Everything inside him screamed to run, to fight, to do something. But all he could feel was confusion and a strange, sinking guilt. Whoever these people were, whatever deal she was talking about, it was connected to him somehow. He could feel it in his bones. The cars stopped at the gate. The headlights stayed on, illuminating the fog like ghostly eyes. No one stepped out yet, but the air was electric with tension. The billionaire turned toward her again, his voice shaking but firm. "Go inside," he said. "Now." She hesitated for a second, then nodded and hurried toward the house, clutching her belly. He stood there for a moment, staring into the blinding light, his heart pounding. He didn't know who was in those cars or why they were here, but one thing was certain. The life he had built on silence and secrets was about to collapse. And this time, there would be no hiding behind locked gates or fortune. The past had finally come home, and it had found him. The night had swallowed the mansion again, but this time it wasn't peaceful. It felt alive, trembling with fear and unspoken truths. The 2 black cars sat just beyond the gate, their headlights glowing through the fog like watchful eyes. The billionaire stood motionless for a long moment, his pulse thundering in his ears. He had faced ruthless competitors, government investigators, even threats to his empire before. But this was different. This wasn't about business. This was personal. And the woman inside his house, the one who had vanished years ago, was somehow the key to all of it. He finally turned and walked back inside, his steps echoing against the marble floor. The woman was standing near the stairs, her face pale and her hands trembling. "Who are they?" he demanded again, his voice sharper now, almost desperate. She hesitated, her lips trembling. "People who don't forgive," she whispered. "People who made sure you'd have everything, and made sure I'd have nothing." He stared at her, trying to piece together the fragments of her words. "You think I'd have worked with people like that?" he said, his tone filled with disbelief. But she didn't answer. Instead, she walked slowly to the window and looked out at the gate. "They were watching even when you didn't know it," she said softly. "Every move you made, every deal you signed, they were there, in the shadows, pulling the strings. You were their success story, their golden investment." Her voice cracked slightly. "And when I tried to stop it, they took everything from me." His jaw tightened. He wanted to deny it, to call it madness, but flashes of memories came rushing back. Deals that had gone too smoothly. Investors who had appeared out of nowhere and disappeared just as quickly. A mysterious funder he had never met face to face, but who always seemed to know exactly when to step in. He had ignored it all because he was too busy chasing power. But now, the pieces began to fit together and he hated what they formed. The sound of a car door slamming outside snapped him back to reality. He rushed to the window. Two men in black suits were walking toward the gate, their movements slow and deliberate. His security system still showed no alerts, as if someone had disabled it. He felt a chill crawl down his spine. "Get upstairs," he told her firmly. "Don't come down until I tell you." She hesitated, fear written across her face. "Please don't talk to them," she begged. "If they see you with me—" "I'm not hiding," he interrupted. "Not in my own house." She looked like she wanted to argue, but the determination in his eyes stopped her. Without another word, she turned and slowly climbed the stairs, one hand on her stomach, the other gripping the railing. When she disappeared from view, he turned toward the door just as the doorbell rang. One sharp, deliberate sound that echoed through the vast hall. He opened the door to find two men standing there, tall, expressionless, their eyes hidden behind dark glasses despite the night. The taller one spoke first. "Mr. Stone," he said in a calm, almost polite tone, "we're here for someone who doesn't belong on your property." He narrowed his eyes. "You're trespassing," he said evenly, "and I don't recall inviting anyone." The man gave a faint smile. "We're not here for you, sir. We're here for her." His heart pounded, but he kept his face calm. "There's no one here but me." The man's smile widened just slightly. "That's unfortunate. We were told otherwise." The billionaire stepped closer, his voice low and cold. "I don't care who told you anything. You have 10 seconds to leave before I call the police." The man tilted his head, amused. "You think the police can protect you? After all these years, you still don't understand how deep this goes." That sentence sent a shiver down his spine. He didn't show it, but inside panic flickered. "If you're threatening me," he said, "you'll regret it." "We're not threatening you," the man said calmly. "We're reminding you of an agreement. One you benefited from. One that required her disappearance." He froze. The air around him seemed to stop moving. "What did you just say?" The man's smile faded. "You built your empire with our help, Mr. Stone, and she was the price. You knew that, even if you chose to forget." He shook his head slowly, disbelief and anger battling for control. "You're lying," he said through clenched teeth. "I never made any deal like that." The man shrugged. "Maybe not directly, but your company did. You just signed the papers. You didn't read the fine print." Before he could respond, the second man stepped forward. "Where is she?" he asked flatly. "We don't need trouble. Just hand her over and you'll never hear from us again." His pulse raced. He could hear faint movement upstairs. Maybe her pacing, maybe her fear. He squared his shoulders and stepped forward, blocking the doorway. "You're not taking anyone from this house," he said, his tone final. "Now leave." The first man sighed and exchanged a glance with his partner. "That's unfortunate," he said quietly. "We hoped this would be easy." Then, without another word, they turned and walked back toward the cars. But something in the way they moved, calm, confident, unhurried, filled him with dread. They weren't leaving in defeat. They were planning their next move. When the cars finally disappeared into the fog, he shut the door and locked it, his hands shaking slightly. He leaned against the wall, trying to steady his breath. His mind raced with fragments of what the men had said. The agreement, the disappearance, the price. None of it made sense, yet it explained everything at once. He had spent years believing he was self-made, that his success was his alone. But what if it wasn't? What if every achievement had been orchestrated? Every fortune built on someone else's pain? He climbed the stairs slowly, each step heavy with guilt and confusion. When he reached the top, she was waiting at the end of the hallway, her eyes full of fear. "They're gone," he said quietly. "For now." She nodded but didn't relax. "They never stop," she whispered. "They'll come back. They always do." He walked closer, his voice firm but trembling. "Then tell me what they want. Tell me what they did. No more secrets." She looked at him for a long time, her expression full of exhaustion and sorrow. "You want the truth?" she said softly. "It's worse than you think." And as the lights in the mansion flickered, just for a second, as if the power had been cut, he realized the storm outside wasn't the only one coming. The real storm was already inside. The mansion was swallowed by darkness. The sudden flicker of lights dying out made the silence heavier, almost suffocating. Only the faint glow from the fireplace downstairs painted ghostly shadows on the walls. The billionaire froze where he stood, every instinct screaming that this wasn't a simple power outage. The air felt different now, colder, charged with something invisible yet suffocatingly close. He turned toward her, his voice low but urgent. "Stay here," he whispered. "Don't move." But she caught his hand before he could step away, her grip trembling. "Don't go," she whispered, her voice breaking. "If they've cut the power, it means they're already inside." Her words sent a chill through his chest. He had enough security to protect a small city. If they'd made it past all of it without a single alert, then whoever they were, they weren't just dangerous, they were powerful. He hesitated for a moment, torn between protecting her and facing whatever threat had come for them. Then it happened. A faint creak of a floorboard from downstairs. He looked toward the staircase, his muscles tensing. Someone was in the house. He motioned for her to stay back and moved slowly toward the stairs, his steps silent, his heartbeat echoing louder than any sound in the room. From the landing, he could see a shadow moving near the living room, tall and deliberate. Another followed. Two silhouettes slipping through the darkness like it belonged to them. He ducked behind the railing, his eyes adjusting to the faint light. He could make out their outlines, men in black, the same ones who had been at the gate. They were searching the rooms, quiet and methodical, like they knew exactly what they were looking for. And suddenly he understood. They weren't just here for her. They were here for something she had brought with her. Something more than just the child. He turned back toward the hallway, motioning for her to move, but she wasn't there. Panic flashed through him. "Where are you?" he whispered, barely audible. Then from the end of the hallway a soft whisper came. "Here." She had hidden in the guest room, the door barely open. He rushed to her side and slipped inside, closing the door behind him. She looked terrified, her hands shaking as she pressed something against her chest. A small metal case, old and worn. He frowned. "What is that?" he asked. She hesitated, then handed it to him. "This is what they're after," she whispered. "Proof of what they did to you, to me, to so many others." He stared at the case. It was no bigger than a book, but it felt heavier than it should. "What's inside?" he asked. "Documents, names, records," she said. "Everything that ties your company, the company they built through you, to the people who destroyed lives for profit. They thought I was gone, that the evidence was lost. But I took it the night they came for me." Her voice cracked. "That's why I ran. That's why they'll never stop." He opened the case, and inside were files, photos, signed contracts, evidence that connected powerful names to crimes buried under layers of corporate deception. As he flipped through the pages, his world began to unravel. Everything he had built, every deal, every fortune, it had all been tainted by the same corruption he'd thought he was above. And she had carried that truth alone for years, hunted for protecting him from it. He closed the case, his hands trembling. "We can go to the authorities," he said. "We can expose them." She shook her head. "You don't understand. They own the authorities. They own everything. Then we run," he said firmly. "We can disappear." Her eyes filled with tears. "You don't run from people like this, you hide. Until they find you." Suddenly, footsteps echoed in the hallway. They were close. The door handle turned slightly. He grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the window. "We have to go, now." She hesitated, looking down at her belly. "I can't climb," she whispered. Without thinking, he wrapped his arm around her and guided her toward the fire escape outside the window. They moved fast but silently, the cold night air biting at their skin. Below, the fog had thickened, swallowing the garden in gray. As they reached the ground, a voice called from inside the house. "You can't hide forever." It was one of the men. The sound sent a shock through him. He tightened his grip on her hand and ran toward the trees at the edge of the estate. Branches scratched against their clothes, and the earth was slick with rain, but they didn't stop. Behind them, flashlights cut through the fog. The chase had begun. They reached the old greenhouse near the back of the property, a place long forgotten, overgrown with vines and shattered glass. He led her inside, pulling the door shut behind them. Both of them were gasping for breath. She sank down onto a crate, clutching her stomach, her face pale with exhaustion. "We can't keep running," she said weakly. "You have to leave me." He shook his head violently. "I'm not leaving you." "Not again." Tears streamed down her cheeks. "If they catch us, they'll kill you. But if you go, you can still make this right. You can end what they started." He crouched beside her, his voice trembling. I don't care about the company, the money, any of it. I just care about you." She smiled faintly through her tears. "You always said that too late." A crash from outside made them both freeze. The men were close. She pressed the metal case into his hands. "Take it," she whispered urgently. "Take it and go, please, for the baby." He shook his head, but she pushed it into his chest. "You can save us. Just not tonight." The sound of footsteps grew louder. Flashlights pierced through the cracks in the glass. He wanted to argue, to refuse, but her eyes, filled with love, fear, and resignation, told him it was already decided. He kissed her forehead softly, his hands shaking. "I'll come back for you," he whispered. She smiled sadly. "You always say that too." Then he slipped out the back of the greenhouse, clutching the case, disappearing into the fog just as the door burst open behind him. Shouts echoed through the night. He didn't look back. He couldn't. Hours later, as dawn broke over the city, a news alert flashed across every channel. Massive data leak exposes corruption within billion-dollar corporations. Names, documents, everything from that metal case had been sent anonymously to journalists around the world. The truth was out, and somewhere far from the mansion, hidden in the quiet of a small clinic, a woman lay in a hospital bed, cradling her newborn. She looked out the window at the rising sun and whispered softly, "You're safe now." No one would ever know her story. No one would know how one desperate night changed everything. But the billionaire would never forget the moment she appeared at his gate. Because in saving her, he had finally found something money could never buy: redemption.